Good morning. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Today we are in lesson 43 of the Gospel of Matthew, and we're covering Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16, and this one's called Called or Chosen. In this chapter, the action is slow-paced, ministry-paced. Starting in the next chapter, with the cross on the horizon, the pace will increase in anticipation of that event. In the previous chapter, Jesus told his disciples that they would sit on thrones and judge the tribes of Israel. Though Jesus did not make this clear, logic would tell us that Judas Iscariot would not be included. My guess is that the 12th apostle in that role will be Paul, as Jesus certainly chose him, even though a bit later than the others. In today's study, we will continue to look at what it means to be chosen, in addition to rewards. Let's read our first section. Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 7 says this: "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. Now when he had agreed with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into the vineyard. And he went out about the third hour and saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right I will give you.' So they went. Again he went out about the 6th and the 9th hour, and did likewise. And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing idle, and said to them, 'Why have you been standing here idle all day?' They said to him, 'Because no one hired us.' He said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right you will receive.'" Once again, Jesus speaks in parables. This parable begins with the landowner who hires laborers early in the morning to work in his vineyard. The laborers agreed to his wage of 1 denarius each for a day's labor. 3 hours later, the landowner hired some additional laborers. He promised to pay the second group of laborers what was right. He hired more laborers 6 hours into the day, and then even more laborers 9 hours into the day. Once again, the landowner promises to pay the laborers the wage that is right. In this passage, the word right is dikaios. Finally, he hired more workers in the 11th hour. The first group of laborers, hired earliest in the morning, agreed to a specific wage, 1 denarius. At that time, a denarius was the typical daily wage of a worker. But notice that the laborers who were hired at the 3-hour mark, the 6-hour mark, the 9-hour mark, and the 11-hour mark did not have a specified wage. Instead, the landowner promised to pay them the wage that was right. Right in this usage means upright, righteous, virtuous, and in line with the commands of God. It also means approved or accepted by God. This is the kind of contract that may or may not prove to be beneficial for both parties. Years ago, when I was working as a tennis professional in a city of extremely wealthy people in Southern California, one lady asked me for lessons, but wanted a bargain. I explained to her that I did not give different rates for different people, and that my wage was fair. Looking back on those years, I sometimes wonder how I was able to continue paying rent in such an expensive location. After much discussion, I finally told the lady that I would leave it up to her, and she could pay me what she thought the lesson was worth. Of course, I thought that she would get so much out of the lesson that she would just pay my regular wage. This is another example of a contract without specific terms. At the end of the lesson, she paid me less than half of my normal rate. She also said she'd learned a ton and would love to set up more lessons. Of course, I told her that I was not interested. Looking back on that, the only person to blame was me, but I was offended by her lack of decency. She did not pay me the right wage. I don't know if she learned a lesson that day, but I certainly did. Let's read the next passage. Matthew chapter 20, verses 8 through 16 says this. So when evening had come, the owner of the vineyard said to his steward, Call the laborers and give them their wages, beginning with the last to the first. And when those came who were hired about the 11th hour, they each received a denarius. But when the first came, they supposed that they would receive more. And they likewise received each a denarius. And when they had received it, they complained against the landowner, saying, These last men have worked only 1 hour, and you made them equal to us, who have borne the burden and the heat of the day. But he answered one of them and said, Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what is yours and go your way. I wish to give to this last man the same as to you. Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with my own things? Or is your eye evil because I am good? So the last will be first, and the first last. So many are called, but few chosen. In this parable, Jesus explains that all of the workers were paid the same wage, regardless of how many hours they had worked. Of course, the workers who had worked the entire day thought that this was unfair. But interestingly, those were the only workers who had agreed to the offered wage of 1 denarius. The landowner thought that he was being both fair and righteous, as he paid them exactly what he said he would pay them. The 4 other groups of workers, who had started at different times later in the day, also received the same payment, 1 denarius. The landowner's contract with each of these groups was that he would pay them the right amount. Certainly, it was an acceptable wage to each of the 4 later groups, but notice the order in which these groups were paid. If the order of payment had been reversed, there would not have been any disappointment. For example, if the landowner paid the first group 1 denarius, as those workers who started earliest had accepted, once that group received their payment, they would have happily gone their way. And then the next group that had been hired 3 hours later would have been tickled to death to receive the same pay as those who had worked 3 hours longer. They also would have departed happily. The next group, 6 hours into the day, in similar fashion, would have been ecstatic that they received a day's pay for only a few hours of work. And the same for the group hired 9 hours into the day. Finally, the last group would have been the happiest, receiving the same pay for only an hour of labor. Consequently, the dissatisfaction with the wage when the first hired were the last to be paid had more to do with the knowledge that others seemingly had received a better bargain. The landowner in this parable is God the Father. The workers hired the earliest were the Jews, who were God's chosen people and received God's offer of salvation first. The workers hired later were the Gentiles. The vineyard was the world. The steward is Jesus, and as he will be the judge of all people, Jesus will decide the wages or rewards of all. People sure were not lazy in those days, as the days were 12 hours long. Part of the lesson here is that we should be satisfied with the terms we have agreed to, rather than comparing our contract to others. The statement at the end of this parable ties it into the previous chapter in Matthew and summarizes the meaning of both chapters. So the last will be first and the first last, for many are called, but few chosen. There are many examples of this adage in the Bible. In Judaism, in Israel in biblical times, the firstborn son was given priority. Status was a birthright. Remember, Esau sold his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of lentil soup. Often, the firstborn son inherited his father's property, and if not all of the property, he inherited the majority of it. Interestingly, the nation of Israel is an example of the firstborn from God. Certainly, salvation was offered to the Jews first, and the Gentiles, which means nations in Hebrew, received that offer of salvation after the Jews passed on it. We often can see biblical examples of God not following the cultural preeminence when not choosing the firstborn. Remember, Joseph was the chosen son, not Reuben, though Joseph was born 11th of 12 sons, and Reuben was born first. In the same manner, among the sons of Jesse, God chose the shepherd boy David to be king of Israel, instead of his older brothers, even though they were warriors. Paul brought this point home when he wrote this in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 26 through 31. For you see your calling, brethren, that not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty, and the base things of the world, and the things which are despised, God has chosen, and the things which are not, to bring to nothing the things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence. But of him you are in Christ Jesus, who became for us wisdom from God, and righteousness, and sanctification, and redemption. That, as it is written, he who glories, let him glory in the Lord. One of the most interesting examples occurred when Jesus was on the cross. Both of the thieves next to Jesus began by making fun of him, but one of the thieves changed his tune and stated to Jesus, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus responded by telling that thief that later that day he would join Jesus in paradise. Think about that for a moment. That thief lived his entire life without God and was being crucified for criminal behavior. He came to salvation moments before his death in the 11th hour while on a cross. Jesus did not miraculously remove the thief from the cross and encourage him to live a more godly life, to prove that he had been transformed from ignoring God to following him. Instead, that one decision to follow Jesus was honored. The Bible teaches us about the Bema Seat judgment in Romans 14 and 1 Corinthians 5. Believers will not be judged for their sins, unlike unbelievers. Instead, they will face a different judgment. And at the Bema Seat, believers will be rewarded for how they live their lives as Christians. Who knows what the rewards will be for the thief on the cross who repented moments before death? Imagine the rewards for John the Baptist, filled with the Holy Spirit in the womb, who took a Nazirite vow and spent his life preparing the way for Jesus before being martyred. As believers, our motives for rewards likely will also be judged. Have we glorified Jesus with our lives? Or have we done good things trying to earn rewards? There likely will be believers in heaven without a crown, but that is still a believer in heaven. This parable is representative of God's offer of salvation to both Jews and Gentiles. Certainly the Jews were the workers who arrived earliest in the day, while the Gentiles are representative of the workers who came later. The same wage is offered to all, both Jews and Gentiles. The Gentiles, hired later in the day, are under grace, while the Jews, hired first, are under the law. God the Father sent Jesus to die on the cross to pay for the sins of all the world. Remember, God so loved the world. God offered salvation to all of the world. Many are called. The offer of salvation was for all, but not all who have been called to salvation accepted that offer. Those who accept God's offer of salvation have been chosen by God. Bible scholars have argued about this doctrine for years, and honestly, there is no way of knowing all the nuances or levels that likely occur. Do we choose God, or does God choose us? My answer always has been yes. There are so many verses in the Bible that tell us that God chooses us, but at the same time, God gave us free will. Is it possible that God chooses us and we choose God? Does it really matter who does the choosing? Certainly, there are many marriages that occur when the woman is only interested in one man and the man is only interested in one woman. It might be that one does the asking, but both do the choosing. But the difference in this situation is that only God knows everything. Some think that he chooses us because of what we bring to the table. But what is much more likely is that God chooses us to demonstrate his grace and his love. He chooses the foolish things of the world. So if you wonder where you fit in that category, read that verse again. After all, he said, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. God gives us all of our gifts and talents. He chooses us regardless of those talents, not because of them, as he could have given those talents and gifts to whomever he wanted. I think it is much more about our hearts than anything else. If we accept God's offer of salvation, it is because God chose us. In closing, for those waiting for a deathbed acceptance of Jesus, like the thief on the cross, there are no guarantees you will have that opportunity or that your heart will not have hardened. There is no time like the present, and we need more laborers in the vineyard. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Have a blessed day.